Welcome to the Archaeology Studio. Today's episode concerns how to study enigmatic features, in this case looking at unusual craters in the coastal forest of Guam. By the end of this episode, you will be prepared to apply critical thought when interpreting sites or features that at first may appear to be ambiguous or anomalous. In developing your interpretations, you can consider the roles of form, function, and context. You should be able to combine different lines of evidence that otherwise might be incomplete or inconclusive on their own. This presentation concentrates on craters or crater-shaped features at the Ritidian site of Guam, but you should keep in mind about how to apply these lessons in other cases. At the northern edge of Guam, the landscape at Ritidian embodies thousands of years of natural and cultural history. Several layers of archaeological findings extend back at least as early as 1500 BC, and they continue through AD 1700, and even more recently in historical contexts. Among the many features of this special place, you can find a number of craters in the coastal forest. These craters may not be obvious at first. The forest growth can be dense, and it can obstruct the view of the ground. If you can see through the vegetation or in enough cleared area, then you can notice the large depressions or crater-shaped features in the ground. The diameters are more than 15 meters, well beyond the scope of any natural opening in the forest today. Additionally, sediments and debris have filled into these sloped depressions, thereby masking their original sizes and depths. At least in a few examples, you can see arrangements of stones lining the interior sloped surface. The stones are closely fitted together and they appear in even horizontal rows, one row laid over another. These characteristics indicate that people deliberately constructed the stone lining. Several of these features can be found in the area, all approximately in the same size and shape. They are roughly circular in plan view, and they measure 15 to 18 meters in diameter. In the cases that are most free from infilling of debris, their depths have been measured at least 2.5 meters. The interior slopes become increasingly steep with depth. The middle to lower portions that are the most steep contain the stone lining, whereas the uppermost and least sloped portions contain no stone lining. In some cases, you can see that the craters have been excavated through pre-existing layers, and the excavated material was redeposited around the exterior. These features evidently disturbed and displaced pre-existing archaeological layers and the ruins of an ancient village of the local Lati tradition, last occupied during the 1680s or 1690s. The surrounding area reveals an unusually high degree of disturbance of the old Lati village. Where the Lati ruins still have survived, they represent the last time when people lived in this traditional village, prior to forced relocation during the Spanish imperial period. By the year 1700, the people of Ritidian and other villages had been removed and relocated into Spanish-controlled areas. The crater features certainly post-dated the context of the Lati, so we can focus our attention on the more recent historical periods. Before we search through the historical references, first we should know more clearly about these large depressions or craters. We do not yet know how deep they extend into the ground because they have been covered by more recent sediments and debris. In fact, Many of these features have been difficult to identify in the first place, and some have been almost entirely covered from modern view. Even with high-resolution mapping imagery, the craters are not always discernible. Using a 2007 LiDAR dataset that can distinguish differences in depths as small as 50 centimeters, some of the craters are obvious, but others are unclear. Eventually, the features were documented by systematically walking through the entire forest as part of a larger archaeological investigation. Beneath the dense vegetation, one feature in particular proved to be most informative, and it has supported the interpretation of these features as handmade wells. The perimeter of the crater can be seen as slightly sloped, with scattered debris redeposited from the excavated interior. The deeper portion had been excavated with increasing steepness moving downward, eventually descending vertically. These lower portions were lined with stones, all closely fitted together and positioned in even rows, one over the other. The bottom had been filled by recent sediments and debris, but originally it would have extended into the underlying water table. The stone lining primarily functioned to maintain the shape of a well, preventing it from collapsing inward. The upper rows of the stone lining could have supported people standing there while lowering or raising buckets inside the well. At this point, we can search in the historical references, specifically looking for mentions of hand-dug wells at the Ritidian area. After the termination of the traditional Lati village by the year 1700, the known historical use of this area involved farming and ranching, without formal village settlement. These parameters help to guide our search through the historical references. Thankfully, the historian Dr. Carlos Madrid already has published his research about this topic. In 1819, Louis de Freycinet recorded farmlands at Ritidian. He mentioned chickens and numerous crops, but he did not comment on any wells. Slightly later, in the year 1832, Governor Villalobos distinctly mentioned the wells used for agricultural fields here. The wells definitely were being used by 1832, but how much earlier could they have been constructed? Most likely, the traditional Lati village already had been abandoned for some generations before people dug the wells in a substantially different context. Another aspect of the changing historical context was the operation of the Manila Galleon trade that drove much of the Spanish imperial presence in the region. The galleon traffic operated from 1565 through 1815. Ships departed from Manila in the Philippines, obtained gold and other products in Acapulco, and then returned to Manila, often with an intermediary stop at Guam. When the galleon trade terminated in 1815, the economy and many other aspects of life in Guam underwent major transformations. Given this context, the farmlands and the wells at Ritidian may have become more important for local economic survival after the galleon trade had ended. Our next clue in this study comes from historical debris on the surface near one of the largest wells, in particular looking at fragments of blue-on-white porcelain. These items tend to be highly distinctive of individual manufacturing workshops and narrow time ranges of a few decades or even a single year. In this case, the porcelain fragments matched positively with the cargo from a well-known shipwreck of the Tek Sing that sailed from Xiamen in southern China in January of 1822. Shortly thereafter, in February of 1822, the ship wrecked on a reef near the island of Betilung between Sumatra and Borneo. Among its abundant and diverse cargo, one of the sets of blue-on-white porcelain matched with the findings from Ritidian. We now can conclude confidently that the mysterious craters in fact were hand-dug wells used for agricultural fields. The time frame definitely included the 1820s and 1830s, and it may have extended some years earlier or later. The primary focus, though, post-dated the end of the Manila Galleon trade and a changing economic situation. Now knowing these parameters, what further questions could you pursue, and what lines of evidence would you need to find? In concluding this episode, now you should be familiar with how to define the form, function, and context of enigmatic features, such as you have seen in the example of the craters or wells at the Ritidian site of Guam. You can apply these lessons for solving other situations where the archaeological record may at first seem to be ambiguous or inconclusive. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you will explore more with the Archaeology Studio.